I had an amazing relationship with my mom. She was a nurturer. She was more of a caregiver, and she was my hero. My dad, on the other hand, I hated him. I have just climbed the last mountain in the Colorado Rockies. I'm about to descend down into the Midwest, into the plains of Kansas. There was so many mixed emotions of the days and weeks of going through these mountains and the pain and the agony of the climbing, as well as the physical pain that I was going through from the previous crash. That was still lingering, but also I was looking forward to the descent. I was looking forward to the rest as I would descend down into the plains of Kansas, as well as what I thought was going to be just a downhill coast all the way to the oceans of North Carolina. What I didn't realize was I was in for a big surprise. At this point, I'm averaging 100 miles a day. Like I said, I had the pain still lingering from the crash, and it began by day after day as I'm in the Midwest, as I'm coming out of Colorado, going into Kansas, cornfields on my left, cornfields on my right, the same repetitive picture day after day. I felt like I was in the movie Groundhog Day. It just kept repeating itself. The mundaneness of the trip started wearing on me. When I was in the mountains, it was constant pressure on the pedals. If I slowed down or if I stopped pedaling, I went backwards. That had its own challenge. As I was descending down a mountain, I would get a break. I would be able to coast. And although my legs would get a nice break, mentally I had to be very focused because now I'm at speed. I'm descending down these mountains 40, 50 miles an hour, and I had to be extremely focused to make sure that I didn't do anything that could cause me to crash. Now I've gone into the flatlands. If I slowed down or stopped pedaling in the flatlands, that meant I stopped moving. And I just have looked at life in that aspect where every part has its challenge. The climbing had its challenge, just the constant grind. The descending had its challenge of the extreme mental focus. And the flatlands had its challenge of you just had to keep continuous pressure on these pedals to be moving forward. I had to just keep pedaling. Day after day would go by, and the boredom, the mundaneness of the trip was just eating away at me mentally. I reflected back to my childhood of growing up and the relationship I had with my dad. I had an amazing relationship with my mom. She was a nurturer. She was more of a caregiver, and she was my hero. My dad, on the other hand, I hated him. He was a hard person to live with. He was a former Marine. Discipline was hard. So many rules. I couldn't meet up. I couldn't do things right. And all I wanted growing up was my dad to be my hero. All I wanted was somebody to look at me and tell me he loved me. All I wanted was to feel like I could crawl in his lap and look at him like a true dad, like somebody I longed to be like. But I never had that. I never experienced that. I experienced tiptoeing around to make sure that I wouldn't get in trouble for something. I experienced on Sunday mornings when it was time to go to church and my dad's alarm clock was going off to get up and go to church, I would go and turn his alarm off so he wouldn't wake up, hoping that he wouldn't catch me and hoping he wouldn't see me and that he would stay sleeping so that me and my siblings and my mom, we could go to church and have the peace without him and his attitude and his way of going about doing things that always ended up being disciplined in some sort of way. It was hard. Growing up, I avoided him in every way possible. I had zero respect for him. I didn't want to know about him as an individual. Every time I got close to him, he was beating me. He was abusive. He was doing something. The amount of beatings, the amount of things that he did, and it didn't matter what it was. If I was close by, he would hit me with a board. He would hit me, he'd throw something at me. It didn't matter. And so I grew hard. And by the time I was 18 years old, the last thing I wanted to do is be under his roof. And so I moved out at 18, started figuring out life on my own. I put him in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to have anything to do with him. And so as I'm pedaling through Kansas, I reflected back on that relationship. However, what was happening throughout this trip was my dad would get involved and he would call me and he would check on me. And it was a new surprise for me to have someone who I hated so much that I didn't want to have anything to do with. Now he was getting in my world. Now he was asking questions, and almost to the point that it was even a little too much. At one particular time, the heat was just unbearable. And I found this little shade tree. It wasn't even much of a tree. It was almost like a large bush. And I crawled underneath this bush to just get away from the sun. And I've got my bicycle and the bicycle trailer off to one side. The road is right in front of me. I'm 10 or 15 feet from the road. But this was just one little area I was able to get some relief from the sun. So I'm underneath this little tree, enjoying the shade. An hour goes by, 2 hours goes by, 3 hours goes by. And before I started my trip, I let all of my friends and family have access to seeing where I was at through a GPS monitor. And my dad was one of them. And in the very beginning, I felt like my true friends and my fans would be my friends and fans throughout. And the ones who were not, I wasn't concerned with. But one thing that I didn't realize would happen was the ones who weren't my fans became my biggest fans. And my dad happened to be one of those. And as I'm on that third hour of being under that tree, enjoying the shade, I get a phone call from my dad. I'm like, "Hey, Dad, what's going on?" He goes, "Hey, is everything okay? I haven't seen your GPS move in 3 or 4 hours." And I said, "Dad, I'm taking a break. I'm under a shade tree and I just need a break." And little by little, it was putting these thoughts in my head of my dad wanting to get in my world. My dad was curious on how I was, which was something I longed for as a kid that I never got. And so day after day went by. Again, averaging 100 miles a day. I'm going through Kansas and the beautiful sunrises in the morning and the sunsets in the evening over these cornfields was spectacular. But the mental repetitiveness and the challenge I was going through was at times unbearable. I had to do something. I had to get creative. Otherwise, I felt like I was going to go crazy. The more cornfields that I passed, the more I started seeing grasshoppers jumping on the road. They were coming from these fields and they just kept jumping on the road. And I didn't want to hit them. I didn't want to squish them under my bike tires. And so I created a little bit of a game of avoiding these grasshoppers. I would swerve to the left and swerve to the right and just back and forth. This little zigzag path I was creating to avoid hitting these grasshoppers. And with all the time I had spent on my bicycle, I even learned how to flick them. And I would flick them off the roads with my front tire to avoid squishing them under the tires. It wasn't long I was getting bored of that game. I had to think of something different. Every so often I would pass one of the electric power poles. And I had this curious thought, how many electric power poles are in a mile? And so I started my little mileage counter, and 1 power pole, 2, 3, 10, 12, 15. There was the end of 1 mile. I'd started again. 1, 5, 10, 14. There was 14 in that mile. I'd start the mileage again. Throughout the state of Kansas, 15 electric power poles to a mile. Those little things is what kept me mentally from going crazy. I had to be creative. I had to think of ways to not allow the head trash to build that prevented me from pedaling forward. As I get out of the state of Kansas, the terrain is starting to change a little bit. The view, the look, I'm starting to see a little bit more of trees and greenery. But for the first time in weeks, over 30-something days, matter of fact, I had not had this happen since my very first day of riding. 30-something days later, I come into a storm. And after reflecting on the situation with my dad growing up, this rainstorm, this rain shower was a breath of fresh air. It was pouring. It was refreshing, but it was also a cleansing. I rode into this town. It's pouring down, raining. People are looking at me like, what is this guy doing? This storm is coming. This storm is here. They were going for shelter. There were people standing under awnings and porches to avoid the rain, and I was inviting it. As rain would drip down my face, I was also thinking about my relationship with my dad and how it was transforming and how we have gone from this time growing up where I just couldn't deal with my dad and it was so hurtful and painful and abusive, to now him getting in my world and wanting to know who I was and wanting to know what was going on. And I had to come to a place of forgiveness. And as I would go through that storm, and I would push through that storm, I also felt the cleansing of the relationship of my dad, just the hurt go away. And the restoration of a relationship that I always longed for. And although people had to have thought that I was crazy as I rode through this storm, as water was just running down my face and my body, and rain was even going into my shoes, and my socks were getting wet, my clothes were wet. There was such a refreshing moment. And I knew that I was going to get to the coast at one point and there would be a restoration with my dad. But I wasn't there yet. I had to just keep pedaling. I had to push through that storm. I had to push through that healing because I knew that the sun was coming on the other side. So I just kept pedaling. If you've enjoyed the podcast so far, like, follow, and subscribe so you can be notified when the next episode comes out. And keep listening to this episode of 5 Days of Flatlands to Forgiveness.